So you want to know more about the William Clayton Diaries. Well, you may not know what they are, but I promise you these are some of the most important, controversial, and revealing records to understand Joseph Smith, Nauvoo, polygamy, temple rituals, all the elements that often strike people's fancy when discussing early Mormonism. When I wrote my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, I was very fortunate to get access to nearly all the sources I requested, including the Council of 50 records. The one set of sources that I was denied was the William Clayton Diaries. And that's because there is a long and fascinating backstory to access to these records. Again, one of the most important documents to understanding Nauvoo. So in this video, part of my Friday series of a deep dive on particular historiographical topics, I thought I would provide some background to the William Clayton Diaries, the documents themselves, their long history of being hidden, as well as some spotchy publication records in recent years. I promise you, it's a riveting story, so let's dig in. First, a little bit of background on William Clayton himself. He was one of the first British converts to the Mormon tradition in 1837 when the first Mormon missionaries arrived in the British Isles. He immigrated with the first Mormon immigration camp that left Britain to make it to Nauvoo in 1840, where he very quickly became embedded in a number of social, ecclesiastical, and political organizations for the church. By 1842, he was serving as a clerk and a scribe for not just Joseph Smith, but some of the most important institutions in the city. In fact, a few years later, he received a blessing from Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball saying, "You are going to be a scribe in the resurrection," which doesn't sound like my idea of eternal bliss, but you do you, William. He had a front row seat to some of the most important activities going on, including the secret clandestine practice of polygamy. He became the clerk not just for Joseph Smith, keeping Joseph Smith's own diary for a short while in 1842 and 1843, but then also keeping important records for the Council of 50, the Mercantile Society. He becomes a hymn writer, where on the Trek West, he writes "Come, Come Ye Saints," a favorite hymn. If you want to know more about William Clayton, I strongly recommend the biography by James Allen, No Toil, No Labor, Fear. We're going to be talking about Allen and this biography later on because it fits into the broader history of these important diaries. Because William Clayton was a prodigious record keeper, he kept diaries nearly on a daily basis throughout much of the time from his conversion to Mormonism, his migration to America in 1840, and then throughout the years in Nauvoo. He kept 3 very important diaries during his years in Nauvoo proper, where he was at Joseph's side and witnessed a lot of the events going on. These 3 diaries fit into each other, and we have very clear textual and contextual clues that they're from the days on which he is recording. In other words, these are not later creations. These are not fair copies. These are created in the moment, often the night of the activities taking place or the morning afterwards. And again, there's very clear textual and contextual clues, which I'll talk about later. He is also hired to be Joseph Smith's diary keeper, and Clayton's diary itself doubles as Joseph Smith's diary for a brief time in April of 1843. These are the most rich and detailed accounts of Joseph Smith's Nauvoo dealings. They discuss politics, art, theology, several of the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, like D&C 130 and 131, come from his record keeping. There's also a lot on controversial topics like polygamy, the marital rift between Joseph Smith and Emma Smith, the temple rituals, and all the things that make Nauvoo such a fascinating moment in Mormon history. They were recognized as significant very early on. In fact, while the saints were still in Nauvoo, the church historians, when they start crafting Joseph Smith's history, they borrow William Clayton's diaries to copy entire passages out into the church's own historical account. These diaries were then later donated to the church historian's office in 1854, when again the church historians are working on the history of the church and Joseph Smith's early years. In other words, these diaries, they're rich, they're detailed, they're scandalous, and they're clearly a production during the time period that they are recording. Now let's get to the fascinating moment when historians discover and start using these documents. Now, they had long been sequestered, not made accessible to scholars, believers, even some leaders over the years due to their scandalous nature. However, starting in the 1970s, two church-employed historians who are wonderful scholars were able to gain access to these diaries and make some transcripts and notes. Like if you go into the archive, read some materials, you're going to take notes. That's what these two scholars did. The two were Dean Jesse, who was the early historian of Joseph Smith's own records, produced the papers of Joseph Smith, the 2 volumes, and then later was key to the Joseph Smith Papers project. And the other was James Allen, the assistant church historian who was wanting to work on a book related to William Clayton. Remember the biography I mentioned earlier? We'll return to that in a bit. Then 2 other historians, and I hope you're keeping all these straight, Michael Quinn and Andrew Ehat, got access to either of Jesse's or Allen's notes, or perhaps both. It's not very clear because those 2 figures were also working on important projects. D. Michael Quinn in what eventually becomes his Mormon hierarchy series, and Andrew Ehat was working on his thesis on how Joseph Smith introduced temple rituals, which these notes, these diary entries from William Clayton's diaries were key to understanding that story. And that's where the story gets sticky, because Andrew Ehat was working with a BYU religion professor by the name of Lyndon Cook on a volume that came to be known as The Words of Joseph Smith, one of the first and most important published volumes of Joseph Smith's sermons through a variety of different sources like William Clayton's diaries. Lyndon Cook, who again was a BYU religion professor, was therefore able to get access to the notes that Andrew Ehat had taken based on the Dean Jesse or James Allen notes on the records. You should be following how the different layers or levels or connections in these sources. Those notes that Lyndon Cook took from Andrew Ehat were in Lyndon Cook's office. Now, if you've been to BYU, if you were a student, you are aware that many of those faculty offices, especially back then in the 1970s and 1980s, would then be reappropriated on the weekends as bishopric offices. So a member of a bishopric who was using Lyndon Cook's office on BYU campus discovered these William Clayton diary notes that had been passed down from Andrew Ehat. Those notes then started to be spread around to several other people. And that's where Sandra and Gerald Tanner come in, 2 individuals who were self-identified anti-Mormon experts trying to uncover what they believed to be the fraud of Mormonism. They quickly realized the scandalous nature of these texts, and so they published it in their own volume that contained the more salacious aspects of the William Clayton diaries. Andrew Ehat, remember it was his notes that they used, he ended up suing the Tanners, winning in court, but then that win was overruled on the appeal. Shortly after that, George Smith, the publisher of the book press Signature Books, then published an intimate chronicle in which he took a variety of different diary sources for William Clayton, including his Britain diary and his migration diary, and then his later diary that he kept for Heber C. Kimball of the Temple, as well as the Andrew Ehat notes that were made available through the Tanners, and he published an intimate chronicle, a collection of William Clayton's diaries. James Allen, who, remember, was the assistant historian, by now was back to being full-time BYU history professor, wrote a review explaining the problematic provenance of these sources. That it's not a complete account of what was actually in William Clayton's diaries, so it gives a skewed perspective of what was going on. And B, because you can't compare these notes to the original, it is not proper documentary analysis. George Smith responded to those accusations basically saying that, well, we don't have access to the originals. These are important historical sources, so it justifies their publication. By the way, you can read that whole exchange at a dialogue forum on the editing of William Clayton's diaries and get more on the background. So if you want a deep dive, that's your next stop. This whole issue caused a lot of frustration for LDS Church officials. It reaffirmed their belief that these historians are just after the salacious, that they're not giving full, fair accounts. And so they not only cut off access to William Clayton's diaries, but many of the historical records in the archives, which then became closed for much of the 1980s and 1990s. Fortunately, in the ensuing decades, tensions cooled, there was a bit more of a push of transparency, and there have been several scholars who have been able to gain access to those Clayton diaries. Most prominently, Jim Allen, remember one of the first historians to gain access to make transcript notes way back in the 1970s, finally published his biography, No Toil Nor Labor Fear, which draws on these sources to an extent that no other scholar was able to gain access before. Further, the Joseph Smith Papers Project, sponsored by the church, a fabulous scholarly attempt to collect all the documents that were under the name of Joseph Smith, was able to gain full access to the William Clayton diaries. So you see some of those appearing in the texts themselves when they are classified as Joseph Smith documents, and others that are referred to in supplemental, introductory, or annotations. And so that's a great source to find out what's in the diaries as well. And then the other scholar not employed by the LDS Church, and honestly one of the best historians that America has ever produced, Laurel Ulrich, was also given full access to the William Clayton diaries in the 2010s, which served as a key source for her phenomenal book, A House Full of Females, A History of Mormon Polygamy from the 1830s to 1870. Those diaries were eventually permanently transferred from the First Presidency Vault to the LDS Church History Library in 2017. And that's when the church made a major announcement. Because in 2017, at a conference put on by the Joseph Smith Papers Project, church leaders announced that they were going to be publishing an edition of William Clayton's diaries that weren't going to be censored or redacted except on what they determined to be the most sensitive information, which I read probably temple material. This has prompted a number of questions in the near decade since that announcement. Why is it taking so long, and what's going to be new in this volume that we don't have in the others? Fortunately, I was able to attend a panel on these volumes at the Mormon History Association just a couple of weeks ago, where several of the editors, who are fabulous historians, some of the best documentary historians we have in the Mormon tradition and the Mormon history community, spoke on the volume, William Clayton's diaries, and what we can expect. So addressing the question, why is it taking so long? There's a few reasons. One, they had to finish the Joseph Smith Papers Project first, because the editors who were going to be doing the Clayton diaries had assignments in the Joseph Smith Papers volume. Those volumes are now complete. They're all out, all 27 of them. So then they were able to turn their attention to this Clayton diaries. Second, it takes time to do scholarly annotations and introductions. They have a full army of great scholars who are digging into every word, every date, every piece of paper to try to tease out the broader meanings. So that's why those of you who have read Joseph Smith Papers Project know how rich those volumes are, and it's going to be the same with the William Clayton diary. That's great. It also means it takes time. Third, there's a long review process for whenever church employees are using church sources to publish for the world. And so they're often waiting for feedback and discussion, so it just takes a while. Fortunately, they report that the volume should be out next year. I'm really excited because they have done an excellent work. These are wonderful scholars, and I think the entire Mormon field is going to be benefited from this. The Mormon history field is what I'm talking about. So what's new in this volume that we don't have in An Intimate Chronicle? The Tanner volume, the Jim Allen biography, the Laurel Ulrich volume, JSP. Well, the William Clayton diaries have about 1,170 entries. That's what I mean when I say that is an exhaustive, detailed, and rich source. According to the editors, about 10% of those entries have already been made available in full in these different volumes. Another 25% have been published as excerpts in these different volumes. So in total, about 30% of the entire text is available. And of that 30% that's available is most of the scandalous stuff. They expect that about 95% of the sensitive material is already out there. in the Intimate Chronicle book, in the Tanner volume, in House Full of Females, in the JSP, which makes sense because if you're going through the diaries and you're making your transcript notes, you're probably making notes on the most sensitive material, which is why there's only 30% of the Clayton diaries are out there, but 95% of the sensitive material is already out there. But that doesn't mean there's not good stuff remaining. There's apparently a lot of stuff on just religious life, social activities, how Nauvoo functioned, the very stuff that's going to add flesh to the bones of our stories of Nauvoo. And further, it will be great to have access to what was going on in polygamy in an authoritative account. William Clayton detailed lots of the issues that can be seen as sensitive on polygamy, including when he married a woman, married her her sister as a plural wife, and tried to marry a third sister, but then was told by Joseph Smith, no, I have a revelation that you can only marry 2 women from one family, and also I want to have that third sister for my own. It turns out that third sister turned down both William Clayton and Joseph Smith. As Laurel Thatcher Ulrich writes in House Full of Females, at least one woman in that family knew how to say no. So in other words, if you can't tell, I am really excited for this volume to finally be out. It is really going to be a boon for the Mormon history community, and hopefully it will put to rest all this dumb speculation about these Clayton diaries, which are some of the most important, those far from the only contemporary evidence of Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy. I hope all of that makes sense. And further, I hope you now have some reading suggestions on where you can go if you want to read more about this fascinating story about the documents, not just their contents, but how historians have used them. And again, you'll be looking forward to that volume published by church historians in the next year or so about the William Clayton Diaries. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like it, share it with others, and subscribe to this channel. History has never been more relevant than it is now, and that's why it's so not just fun to geek about these documents, but it's important because these have real consequences for religious communities today.